Welcome to the 19th Century Novel Podcast, Episode 6, Cometh Up as a Flower by Rhoda Broughton. Chapters 1 through 10. In its mostly complimentary review of Rhoda Broughton's 1867 novel Cometh Up as a Flower, the Times of London stated, with obvious exasperation, that it had no patience with these tiresome ladies who marry the man they don't love and make the poor fellow miserable all through the honeymoon with their sighs and tears and dismal faces. The plots of 19th century novels often featured unhappily married wives who didn't merely make their spouse miserable with sighs, but sought fulfillment through adultery. In fact, every novel I've discussed thus far in this podcast series features a marriage in which one or the other partner commits adultery. Lady Loughborough and Arthur Huntington in Anne Bronte's The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, Thomas Ashby in Bronte's Agnes Grey, Isabel Vane in Ellen Wood's East Lynne. To Leo Tolstoy, reliance on this conventional plot revealed an impoverished literary imagination. Adultery, he declares, is not only the favorite, but almost the only theme of all the novels. Of course, before his views about the nature and purpose of art changed according to his Christian ethics, Tolstoy had himself written an adultery novel. Some of the greatest novels of the 19th century, Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary, Kate Chopin's The Awakening, Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, are concerned, like Broughton, with the plight of adulterous wives. Rather than dismissing Broughton's plot as commonplace, as does the Times' anonymous reviewer, we might ask, why was this plot so common? For male authors, female adultery could express their fear of female sexuality and be a projection of their own adulterous behaviors and desires. For female authors, this plot could serve as an expression, however disguised and condemned, of women's sexual desire. And its transgressive and titillating nature surely increased book sales. But perhaps the most convincing answer to why novelists so often wrote about adulterous wives was that they were responding to the unsatisfying and entrapping nature of 19th century marriage, and thereby demonstrating an understanding, if sometimes underdeveloped and unconscious, of the restrictive cruelty of the angel in the house ethos, which declared being wife and mother a woman's ultimate satisfaction. About these concerns, the Times' reviewer seems oblivious, or else thinks them trivial, dismissing the fact that women were often forced into loveless marriages as tiresome, thereby enabling him to identify as the victim not a wife because she has married a man she doesn't love, but a husband because he's made miserable by sighs and tears and dismal faces. One way to appreciate Broughton's novel, therefore, is to ignore its somewhat conventional plot and instead focus on what Broughton reveals about Victorian marriage, how this culture valued commercial exchange over emotional connection, and how these marital arrangements could lead to frustrated sexual desires and unfulfilled emotional needs. The novel, set in the early 1860s and narrated a few years later by Nell Lestrange, opens in a family graveyard. It's 9 p.m. The 19-year-old Nell is reading the inscriptions on tombstones and imagining where she'd like to be buried, while at the same time recognizing the folly of imagining a pleasant burial spot. This scene establishes Nell's often morbid sensibility. It's also the first of her many digressions with which Broughton frequently opens chapters. And Nell's reading of epitaphs suggests her interest in literature, especially poetry. Reading this simple graveyard verse, she fantasizes that one day she might write an elegy comparable to Thomas Gray's elegy written in a country churchyard. Broughton also introduces us to three of the book's central characters. First, Nell. Second, Nell's sister Dolly, whom Nell, anticipating the sisterly conflict to come, imagines would say it is indelicate and unladylike for a grown-up woman to be scrambling over walls. Third, a mysterious man sitting on a tombstone, who we will soon learn is Major Richard Dick McGregor, and who Nell perceives is a gentleman, not any of the John Smiths or Robert Browns of the parish, since the bumpkins in our parts, Nell explains, are not given to indulging in the sentimental melancholy of pilgrimages to the tombs of their respective Betseys and Anns and Marthas. Thus we learn of Nell's social status and snobbery, though the rather frayed elbows on her venerable holland frock suggest the Lestrange family's finances don't match their class status. This suggestion is confirmed as, returning to her family home, Nell notes that we had a big house, but we're not big people, and she laments one consequence of their financial woes. People at whom 50 years ago we turned up our noses now turned up their noses at us. She charts the Lestranges' long family history from arrival with William the Conqueror to fighting in the Crusades with Richard the Lionhearted, to receiving abbey lands from Henry VIII, presumably including their current family home near Manchester. Families like the Lestranges, old money, long-established aristocracy, would increasingly fall prey to the up-and-coming mercantile classes. But just as Ellen Wood does in her novel East Lynne, so Broughton blames this aristocratic family's decline not on the rise of industrial capitalism or on any large-scale systemic forces, but on the family's own failings. The Lestrange family had once, Nell explains, mounted up to the top of fortune's wheel, but recent generations of Lestranges have plummeted the family to the wheel's bottom by squandering their fortune on gambling and whoring. By attributing financial decline to individual behavior rather than to the larger political economy, Broughton appeals to middle-class readers' belief that through hard work and proper moral behavior they can succeed in this economic system, while because of indolence and immorality, some, especially members of the aristocracy, cannot. As a consequence of the Lestrange family's failings, much of their land, they've gone from owning many thousands to very few hundreds of acres, has been bought up by the rising class of mill owners and others prospering from the cotton trade in and around Manchester. Taking advantage of its lead role in the Industrial Revolution and of the reach and power of the British East India Company, with India's large-scale cotton production, Britain dominated the global manufacture of cotton goods in the first half of the 19th century. More than cotton imported from India, according to Ronald Bailey, head of the African American Studies Department at the University of Illinois, cotton grown by slaves in the United States was the main source of cotton used by British textile mills. In 1860, for example, U.S. cotton supplied over 88% of the cotton imported into Great Britain. This process, imports of raw cotton from India and the United States, the manufacture of yarn and cloth, and the export of finished goods, at its height between 1831 and 1850, accounted for an astonishing 43% of all British exports, according to the historian K. Theodore Hoppin. Much of this industry, its textile mills and factories and warehouses and cotton exchange, was located in Manchester, so much so that the town earned the nickname Cottonopolis. By 1853, there were 103 cotton mills, and by 1815, 1,819 warehouses in Manchester, the latter earning the town another, less imaginative nickname, Warehouse City. Work in these factories and living conditions for these workers were abysmal. Alexis de Tocqueville describes the Manchester he visited in 1835. 30 or 40 factories rise on the tops of hills. Their 6 stories tower up. The wretched dwellings of the poor are scattered haphazard around them. But who could describe the interiors of these quarters set apart, home of vice and poverty, which surround the huge palaces of industry and clasp them in their hideous folds? Narrow, twisting roads are lined with one-story houses, whose ill-fitting planks and broken windows show them up, even from a distance, as the last refuge a man might find between poverty and death. Setting her book in Manchester amidst an upper class whose wealth is being generated by the cotton trade, Broughton does not once turn her attention to the workers whose labor produces this wealth, either the British factory workers or the American slaves. As one British bureaucrat explained, Manchester's opulence is really owing to the toil and suffering of the Negro. Nor does she attempt to depict Manchester's slums. It's not Manchester we see, but mansions, the privileged, clean, open, glittering world where the wealthy reside. At 19, Nell has experienced little of this world. She has yet to enter society. She had only once or twice, Nell remarks, exhibited her bare neck and arms to an admiring public. Only once had she been to a ball, and she is about to attend her first dinner party. By contrast, her 23-year-old sister Dolly is worldly wise and a constant guest at social gatherings in pursuit of a rich husband. Dolly parades herself with an air of confidence and superiority. Nell is self-conscious and easily embarrassed. Describing herself as a gawky young stranger, she enters a drawing room with a sense of loneliness, a consciousness of her shabby clothes, and an embarrassment as to the disposal of her hands. Nell is all too aware of her unfashionable appearance. She wears her sister's hand-me-downs, discovers that her hair was dressed in a fashion that had died the death a year and a half ago, and believes herself ugly, especially when contrasted with the glamorous and seductive Dolly, whose liquid brown eyes had a way of looking up meekly and beseechingly that no man could resist, who has a little sharp-cut nose absolutely perfect, a sweet grave mouth, and an expression nun-like, Madonna-like. I never knew any woman who could compare with Dolly Lestrange, writes Nell, in the art of drawing out and waking into rampant life any spice of the devil which might be lurking latent in a man's soul, an art enhanced by her wearing a dark, tight-fitting habit out of which her throat rose like a lily stem from its sheath. With none of Dolly's confidence or coquettish talent, Nell sees for a second time Dick McGregor, the man she had encountered in the graveyard, a tall, broad-shouldered man with yellow hair, a man whose appearance and stature she admiringly compares to a Viking. The couple, having in Hollywood parlance met cute, now suffer through the predictable stuttering first steps of romance, the miscommunications and wounded egos of uncertain lovers, mostly due to Nell's inexperience, self-consciousness, and self-doubt, in tandem with Victorian social probity. For instance, as the dinner party closes, Dick asks Nell if there would be any use of his going to the churchyard the following evening, to which she coldly replies, "I'm sure I don't know. It's nothing to me whether you go there or not. Reviewers compared Cometh Up to Jane Eyre because of Broughton's use of a naive first-person female narrator writing in present tense, who sees herself initially as ugly, and because the book, like Charlotte Bronte's novel, is subtitled An Autobiography. But in the interaction between Dick and Nell, in the ways that pride interferes with their romance, and in its focus on marriage and the upper class, Broughton's novel, especially in its early pages, seems more Jane Austen than Jane Eyre. That Nell is attracted to Dick, the reader has no doubt. After he compliments Nell for her pretty mouth, she describes the dark gray eyes that looked full into mine, with an expression I had never seen in mortal eyes before, an expression that sealed my lips and sent a sort of odd shiver through my frame. And as she leaves the dinner party after having spurned his churchyard invite, she sees him standing under the portico, with the carriage lamps gilding his severe Greek beauty. The next evening, predictably, Nell wanders over to the churchyard. There he stood, Nell writes, tall and straight and strong as a young oak. When he asks to shake her hand, she draws off her glove and lays her hand, a long slim member, in his. They hold hands, Dick detaining my not unwilling though rather embarrassed fingers, holding them as if he had forgotten about them, and looking down, for though I was rather tall, girl, beside him I was small and short enough, at me. MacGregor is the first man to show interest in Nell romantically, the first man whose hand she has embraced. This innocuous and innocent gesture, though, violates Victorian propriety. Thus, when her father stumbles upon them, he is outraged, looking, in Nell's words, extremely astonished and considerably displeased. When they're alone, Nell's widowed father, the Reverend Adrian Lestrange, reproaches her. You're young and inexperienced, and I dare say you meant no harm. But I wonder that even you did not think it was very nice or maidenly to be out at 9 o'clock with that big fellow sprawling at your feet, to say nothing of holding your hand. And he is outraged at MacGregor's behavior, saying he wants a good kicking, uncommon free and easy indeed, walking into another man's garden without saying by your leave, he won't come here again in a hurry. Caught alone at night, holding a man's hand, a man who had not been introduced to her father, Nell has violated a basic code of behavior for young women, and has alienated her father from the man she will come to love. Nell's misbehavior is due to her innocence, but it's also due to her mother's having died when Nell was an infant. Like Isabel in Ellen Wood's East Lynne, Nell has been raised by her father. Without a moralizing mother in the Victorian vein, girls like Isabel and Nell can avoid some of the conventional domestic instruction women were compelled to learn before entering the marriage circuit. As Nell explains, if I had had a mother, I should have had to mend my gloves and keep my hair tidy and practice on the piano and be initiated into the mysteries of stitching. But the absence of a mother leaves Nell, like Isabel, unprepared for the emotional tumult and social pressures of courting and seduction. Without a mother, Nell, thrown into the whirl of balls and dinner parties, must rely for advice on the unreliable Dolly, even asking her sister if she's attractive. Dolly's reply, I don't admire you, but that's no reason why somebody should not. Some people may like red hair and a wide mouth. Dolly's response is disingenuous, for her sister is actually quite attractive, as she slowly discovers through Dick's attraction to her. Likewise, it's Dick's appearance that first attracts Nell. His walk seems to her that of an offended angel. He is a poor, naughty, handsome wolf, and she a lamb who longed to go and put out a friendly paw to him. She can't stop thinking of him, even when in church. When I endeavored to close the doors of my mind against Richard, to observe the Sabbath strictly in my heart, his image pushed the door of that sanctuary without warning, and dwelt there, defying expulsion. Later, she writes, the rain dripped from his hat and from his curly yellow hair, and heaven's tears washed his bronzed cheeks. I looked up at him with shy rapture, at that brow that looked like marble and smelt like myrrh, at the honest, kindly, beautiful face, looked into his passionate eyes, and forgot everything in my new-found wonderful bliss. When he implores her to meet him one night, she tells us, my eyes clave to his face and feasted on its beauty. I would have gone to meet him in a dungeon, in a charnel, in death's stronghold itself. This recognition of Dick's beauty is not merely aesthetic. His appearance stimulates her. She experiences an odd shiver through her frame. Her heart beats faster when he approaches. She rushes out to him like a ball shot from a cannon. And after being with him, she returns to her room panting, disheveled, crimson. My happiness, Nell recalls, was not temperate, moderate, sober. It was limitless, frenzied, drunken. This appreciation of male beauty, this expression of female desire, this yearning to be with a man is contrary to Victorian notions of what a woman should think and how she should feel, let alone what she should openly express. A woman such as Nell, and an author such as Broughton, should not give voice to such feelings. These desires should remain hidden, or perhaps a woman shouldn't feel them at all. Nell here is either too natural, that is, too responsive to her sexual impulses, or in having these impulses is unnatural. Some reviewers objected to Broughton's having a female character who voiced her desires. The London Review, for instance, complained that the unmaidenly manner in which the heroine constantly dwells upon her lover's physical charms is not pleasant. The novelist Geraldine Jewsbury, in the Athenaeum, thought the novel, because it so misunderstood women, because it was ignorant of all that women are or ought to be, written by a man. Jewsbury complained that the only two phases of existence which the author seems to think women recognize are the delight of being kissed by a man they like and the misery of being kissed by one they don't. She concluded that at every page there is some offense against good taste and good feeling, and that the story itself is not one to be put into the hands of girls. And the Spectator complained that for some readers, the novel will have perhaps too much realism. There is too clear an intrusion of the sensuous, too much of clingingness, and the disposition to embrace. In the interaction between Dick and Nell, in their clinginess, we can perhaps see how an upper-class Victorian couple might have behaved before marriage. They hold hands, they hug. Dick demands a toll of 20 kisses. Their lips met joyfully, clingingly, parted grudgingly, loathily. The behavior Broughton describes may have been common for upper-class couples, but not so for working-class couples, who seem to have been considerably more sexually active. In villages and small towns, about 40% of brides in the first half of the 19th century were pregnant, writes Michael Mason, lecturer at University College London. On the other hand, perhaps the behavior of unmarried upper-class couples like Dick and Nell was more sexual than the conventions of Victorian literature and culture would allow Broughton to depict. Or, perhaps Dick and Nell's modest behavior reflects not a cultural norm but Broughton's individual inexperience. In many of her novels, she focuses on thwarted love affairs, on heartbroken and deserted girls. From this evidence, British bibliographer Michael Sadleir concludes that Broughton must herself have suffered an ill-fated love affair, and that if this be granted, the slant of all her work is accounted for, and the feverish element in the first two novels seen to be natural and inevitable. Her novels draw a picture, Sadleir argues, of the authoress's girlhood in its revelation of the intensity and bitter disillusion of an unhappy passion, and in the explanation it offers of her caustic attitude to life in general, and of her preoccupations as a novelist with precocious young girls entangled in luckless love or loveless marriage. But Sadleir's speculation is based solely on her novels. There's no evidence that Broughton had had a heartbreaking love affair. What we do know is that she was born in 1840 in Wales, the third daughter, she also had a younger brother, of the Reverend Delvin Broughton. Her grandfather was the 8th Broughton baronet, the Reverend Sir Henry Delvis Broughton, and Jane Bennet, whose father was a barrister in Dublin. Like Nell's, Rhoda's family had a long history going back on her father's side to the 13th century. When Rhoda was 11, her father took over the family manor, Broughton Hall, about 50 miles south of Manchester. In her biography of Rhoda Broughton, Marilyn Wood gives a good description of this home built in the 1630s and presumably the model for Nell's home. An imposing black and white timbered house with high gables overhanging upper story, fine carving, and superb example of 17th century Flemish glass in some of the windows. Broughton Hall has gone through several hands since the 19th century and is now owned by John Caudwell, founder of a successful mobile phone company, and number 966 on Forbes's 2019 list of the world's billionaires, down from number 722 in 2016. Rhoda Broughton, like Ellen Wood and the Bronte sisters, was educated by her father, from whom, writes Marilyn Wood, she acquired a thorough knowledge of English literature and instruction in Greek, Latin, and modern languages, particularly French, German, and Italian. Rhoda's mother died in 1860, her father in 1863, forcing her and her siblings to leave the family home. In her final year at Broughton Hall, Rhoda, aged 22, wrote in 6 weeks a draft of her first novel, Not Wisely but Too Well. She seems to have been inspired by the example of Anna Isabella Thackeray, who wrote her first novel, The Story of Elizabeth, at age 26. Over the next few years, living with one of her sisters, Broughton finished this novel as well as Cometh Up as a Flower. With the assistance of her uncle, the novelist and short story writer Sheridan Le Fanu, himself the grandnephew of the 18th century playwright Richard Brinsley Sheridan, Cometh Up was serialized in 1866 in the journal he edited, Dublin University Magazine, and published anonymously as a novel in 1867 by Bentley, the same firm that 6 years earlier had published Ellen Wood's East Lynne. However, Bentley's did not initially accept Broughton's first manuscript, Not Wisely but Too Well. Its reader, Geraldine Jewsbury, the same person who recommended that Bentley publish East Lynne, decrying its immorality. The story is absolute and unredeemed nonsense, and the interest is of a kind that I should carefully keep it out of the hands of all the young people of my acquaintance. I am sorry you have accepted it, and I am sorry it is going to be published at all. The interest is of highly colored and hot-blooded passion, pretended to be quenched in a few drops of lukewarm water sentimentality. It is the most thoroughly sensual tale I have read in English in a long time. It is a work so ill calculated for the reading of decent people. Her uncle Sheridan Le Fanu's enthusiasm and support for his niece's work seems to have been tempered by this reaction. In a letter to Bentley, he apologized for her work, writing, "The author's boldness of style and description arises from an unfortunate ignorance of the actual force of some of what is set down, and of the way in which the world, wiser in the knowledge of evil, might read it." Broughton accepted this criticism and rewrote, not wisely but too well, explaining in a letter to Bentley, "I quite agree with you as to its unfitness for publication in its present state. I will do my best to expunge all the coarseness and slanginess and rewrite those passages which cannot be toned down." Her revisions were successful. The novel was published in the same year as Cometh Up. However much her novels might have been viewed as too hot-blooded and unsuited for decent people, the romance in Cometh Up seems juvenile. No surprise, since, as Marilyn Wood explains, like most young women of her class, Broughton's main knowledge of life, and particularly of sexual love, even if there had been a painful affair in her past, was culled from books, both the serious and the light varieties. Looking back on her life, Broughton remembered its innocent deprivations. "My own early youth was, even according to the then measure of dissipation accorded to girls, so very quiet and unaccented a one, spent in the depths of the country." As she observed, one feature of Victorian upbringing was the rigid law that until marriage all girls should be kept in entire ignorance of the most important facts of physiology. We should remember, too, that at this time young men and women were kept apart, and when together at balls and picnics and concerts and dinners, they were chaperoned. Broughton notes that association with young squires and professional men was so restricted and hedged by prohibitions that imagination might and did invest them with a mystery that lent itself to dreams. In other words, this forced separation kept women ignorant about and encouraged them to create ideal images of these strange creatures, men. All that young women had a chance of knowing, she writes, was that he was well-favored and polite, and that he might conceal under his white waistcoat the heart of a Sir Lancelot or the high purity of a Sir Galahad. Broughton's reference to Lancelot and Galahad, learned perhaps from Tennyson's Idylls of the King, suggests the importance of story in shaping expectations, mostly false expectations, of course, unless one is as jaded as Dolly, about men and love and courtship and marriage. Separated from men, except in ideal and protected environs, women often learned what they perceived to be the facts about men from fiction. Or as Broughton puts it, at that period sentiment still exhaled from 3-volume novels and harbored in maiden breasts. In this context, it's understandable that while Nell's description of Dick and of her feelings for him convey her desire, the contact between them is not especially intimate and not at all passionate. They seem more junior high school students on a first date than a 19-year-old woman and a 27-year-old man in the initial stages of courtship. Even though these scenes reflect Broughton's inexperience, the romantic banter between Dick and Nell, especially its condescending tone, is likely accurate to the period. Holding her tightly, Dick says, "Don't cry, poor little girl. What an ill-used little girl she is. Poor little pussycat. It's rather nice, having a foolish sort of little girl to kiss and make love to, and bully now and then." Much later in the novel, he refers to her as "my own little Nell, my own little snowdrop." Dick's referring to Nell as a little girl, his speaking to her as if she is a child, is the standard male view of women in the Victorian era. These passages reveal male's sense of superiority. The male is the adult overlooking the innocent, childlike female, an attitude that is the essence of paternalism. As Mary Wollstonecraft explains, child is but a civil term for weakness, and this weakness must be protected by a man. But Nell shrugs off Dick's paternalistic comments to luxuriate in his embrace. His gold locks and my russet ones blend agreeably together, she writes. I had not the slightest desire that he should leave me alone. I lay my head on his breast, he kisses me softly, and I forget to be scandalized. Interrupting this budding romance, there appears the wealthy, unmarried aristocrat Sir Hugh Lancaster, a man who has been unsuccessfully pursued by many single women, including Dolly. When he first appears at the Lestrange home, he is served a lunch of eggs, the family having no other food and an overdue bill with the butcher. But Hugh cares not at all about this odd meal, nor this evidence of the decline of the family Lestrange. His interest is only Nell, but she is uninterested in him. In an attempt at banter, he tells her, I never can make out what women can have to think about except their crochet work, and asks, What are your pleasant thoughts about? Hugh's comment is no more insufferable than Dick's telling Nell that silence is a woman's best ornament, but Hugh lacks Dick's charm and good looks. And so Nell reacts resentfully, thinking the question suited the intellect of a 5 years child, and responding to his question of what she could be thinking about with nothing worth mentioning, neither fat cattle nor guano. The affable Sir Hugh is not bothered by this remark, replying, You think they are about the only subjects I am fit to talk about. Ah, very good, very good. From this point on, Nell will face a choice. Listen to the urgings of her sister and father and her sense of duty, and marry the rich Lancaster, or follow her heart and marry the penniless MacGregor. For the time being, her heart wins. Cometh Up as a Flower, chapters 11 through 19. Dolly is unequivocal in her view that her little sister give up her childish infatuation with Major MacGregor and embrace the sober reality of Sir Lancaster. In one of the novel's more memorable scenes, telling for what it says about money and status and marriage among the upper classes, Dolly rebuts Nell's proclamations of love. Responding to Nell's swooningly citing lines of verse, and thanking God for being alive and in love, Dolly previews the life her sister would have with Dick. Life in an old barrack with no present income and no future projects hardly seems to me a theme for hallelujahs, for weeping and gnashing of teeth, rather. And when Nell angrily asks her sister why she bothers to return home, since all she does is sneer at it, Dolly replies, I quite agree with you as there being no place like home, not the least for utter destitution of paint and decent cookery and hot water pipes, and all the appliances of modern civilization. This baronial residence is undoubtedly unique. Dolly, on the marriage market for several years, is a jaded realist who sees love as a disabling fiction. She even discounts the importance of her family's noble lineage. Does the knowledge that one lot of moldy old men poked at another moldy old lot in the ribs with pikes 400 years ago make me feel the drafts less, or you look less like a scarecrow? Her experience has given Dolly insight into the intricacies of class and social status. She recognizes that Dick cannot be anybody much, since he is a guest of the nouveau riche Coxes, who have no established family history, and a fortune recently derived from the cotton trade. Dolly immediately recognizes that the Coxes are using their newfound wealth to propel themselves into the upper classes. The Coxes are working up, she explains to Nell, but they have not got up many rungs yet. I suppose they think they will begin with decayed gentlemen such as Dick McGregor and hoist themselves up on their shoulders into the society of prosperous ones. Or, as she later puts it, they are going to try to mix a little poor blue blood with their own full-bodied red. When Nell recalls Dick saying that, like her sister, he considers the Coxes vulgar, he had joked that some of the fluff and flue of Cox's cotton mills was getting into his brain, Dolly replies that a man must be rather low before he will go and stay weeks in a tradesman's family, but he must be lower still to abuse his hosts behind their backs. This passage is revealing for the nuances of status Dolly is able to decode. Dick must be poor if he's staying with the déclassé Coxes. They must be using him to begin their climb up the social ladder. He must be ill-bred if he criticizes them for their vulgarity. For Dolly, on the other hand, their vulgarity goes without saying. They are, after all, mere tradesmen who have spent their lives in calico circles. The fact that their fortune was earned through industry, in both senses of the word, is itself discrediting. For the wealthy aristocracy, born into a life of privilege, look down upon those attempting to join their betters through the vulgar act of earning money. Dick's and Dolly's view of the Coxes is shared by Nell, and perhaps Broughton. The Coxes assertively and ostentatiously display their wealth. Nell describes arriving at their home. We drew up before a Grecian portico, on which are inscribed the arms of the Coxes. Arrived last month from the Herald's College. That is, to appear as peers of the peers, the Coxes have purchased a coat of arms, and thus a family history. As Pamela Gilbert explains, the Herald's College maintained, traced, and sometimes invented family coats of arms. The ridiculousness of this chasing after status is evident in Broughton's description of the family crest. A nondescript antique bird, half cock, half griffin, and supposed to be the cock's crust, showed its ugly stone beak and claws all over the house, in every nook and angle where antique birds could perch. Traditionally, a griffin has the body, tail, and back legs of a lion, and the head and wings of an eagle. Instead of an eagle, it seems, the Cox's griffin is half rooster, the Cox's cock, if you will. Obviously an unheroic and common farm animal. The appearance of the Coxes themselves is no less grotesque. Nell describes a large woman whose roseate arms were fettered with heavy gold bracelets, fresh from the jewelers, and above whose pug face a tiara rose like a mural crown. Besides being large and having a doggish face, this woman is wearing gaudy jewelry, i.e., heavy gold, and rather than a long-standing heirloom, this jewelry has just been purchased, reinforcing the Coxes as vulgar social climbers. She wears the most formal and regal of headpieces, a tiara. In saying that this tiara rose like a mural crown, Nell is identifying it as no modest headdress, but a piece that is conspicuously tall. A mural crown, a headpiece usually of gold with an abstract shape meant to represent city walls and towers, was a Roman military decoration that became a common symbol in heraldry. The sense here is that this headpiece is ridiculously ostentatious and out of place. These often ludicrous attempts to depict themselves as aristocracy resemble what an anonymous cotton spinner wrote in 1818 about the newly rich. The employers, with very few exceptions, are a set of men who have sprung from the cotton shop without education or address, except so much as they have acquired by their intercourse with the little world of merchants on the exchange at Manchester. But to counterbalance that deficiency, they give you enough of appearances by an ostentatious display of elegant mansions, equipages, liveries, parks, hunters, hounds, etc., which they take care to show off to the merchant stranger in the most pompous manner. Indeed, their houses are gorgeous palaces, far surpassing in bulk and extent the neat, charming retreats you see round London. But the chaste observer of the beauties of nature and art combined will observe a woeful deficiency of taste. Unlike the Coxes, Sir Hugh Lancaster, the man pursuing Nell, is from a wealthy family of long standing. Older, smaller, and far less attractive than Dick, Hugh is also far less engaging. He relies on his, in Nell's phrase, little anecdotic wares. He is never strong at badinage, Nell writes. He has a heavy hand at it. He doesn't even adjust his volume when attempting to woo. Hugh never thought it necessary to lower his voice when he said anything tender. The expression love whisper never could be applied to his amatory commonplaces. Love shout or love bellow would be more applicable. We experience an example of his romantic patter when on a sofa next to Nell, looking through a book of dog prints, he comments, "Jolly kind of dog, that. Had one just like it myself once, only mine had more tan about the muzzle. Best sporting dog I ever had. Came to awful grief, poor brute, though. Got caught in a trap and had to be shot." Not exactly a conversation to set a young girl's heart aflutter. Hugh, of course, is oblivious, offering to bring out even more volumes of dog pictures, or as Nell describes, he rises to search for more pablum for my mind and eyes. She implores him, "Oh, please, won't it do another time? I think I've seen enough pictures." While they have been looking at terriers and retrievers and hounds, a jealous Dick has been watching the two of them as they sit side by side in an air a casual observer would see as very lover-like and flirtatious. Nell sees Dick's distress and overhears Dolly telling him that Nell seems pleased with and attracted to Hugh, and that Dick must, as a consequence, feel lonely in society. Nell knows she needs to reconcile with Dick, so the next day, uncharacteristically assertive, desiring to retrieve last night's disaster, she puts her hand on his arm, calls him Dick for the first time, and asks him to drive her in the dogcart because she cannot ride on horseback like the rest of the party who are going on a picnic excursion. For a young Victorian girl, this assertiveness, a gross violation of proper behavior, causes her great upset. As I make this indecently forward proposal, Nell tells us, my voice shakes and my heart thumps like a team ram, that is, like an ironclad ship of the kind used in the American Civil War to ram wooden naval vessels. But this effort, this shouting voice and thumping heart is worth it. Wounded pride healed and the previous night's flirtations forgotten, Dick agrees to drive Nell to the picnic. Until Sister Dolly intervenes. Standing nearby while holding her habit up delicately with one hand and slashing a small laced-up ankle boot with her whip, Dolly overhears Hugh tell Dick that one of the carriage horses can be unruly. This picture encapsulates Dolly, proper yet sensual, holding her habit up delicately, confident and controlling, slashing her boot with a whip, and conniving, listening to Hugh and Dick's conversation. Unbeknownst to her sister, Dolly tells Dick that Nell is afraid of this unruly horse, and that she would therefore rather have the more experienced Hugh as her driver. And so for the picnic, Nell joins Hugh, while Dolly joins Dick. Forced to share a picnic lunch with the insufferable Hugh, Nell watches Dolly flirt with Dick and imagines his being made captive by her sister's charm. Dolly wakes Dick's devil. The great velvet orbs passionate, passion-rousing seek his again, seem unable to tear themselves away. What man can stand it? Dick cannot. And Broughton adds what seems to this post-Freud, post-Georgia O'Keeffe reader an overtly sexual image. Dolly plays with the wide-open iris flowers, with the stiff, wet iris stems that lie in her lap. No wonder Dick seems entranced. I don't know if these stiff, wet irises were inserted into the text unconsciously, or if Broughton did so intentionally. Certainly in not excising this description, these flowers that cometh up, the book's editors and publisher didn't perceive its sexual suggestiveness. However sensual Dolly's behavior and appearance, she has no interest in a man so poor as Dick. She flirts with him because she enjoys exerting her power over men, the only power a woman like Dolly possesses, and in so doing sends a message to her sister. Dick can't truly love you if so easily attracted to me. Interestingly, despite her beauty and skill at seduction, Dolly has been unable to gain a husband. I suspect her romantic disappointment is due to her family's failing fortunes. It's probably also due to her snobbishness, her reluctance to marry a wealthy man who lacks a title. Oddly, she has been unable to snare the oblivious Sir Hugh Lancaster, probably because he seeks a mate more naive, someone not jaded by experience, someone simple enough to love simple him, a girl like Nell. As they return to Wentworth Manor, Hugh's estate, their carriage horses are spooked by a passing train. The carriage is overturned. Nell is tossed into a clump of violets, Hugh into a thorny hedge, and the horses gallop wildly away. When Hugh helps Nell to her feet, she faints, to wake up in a small room where stalest tobacco and stalest beer contend for kinship over the dominion of smell. But it's not this rustic, low-class pub that troubles her. It's what she sees when she wakes. Oh, horror! Oh, shame! Oh, infamy! Hugh's arm is under my head, and his face with the middle-aged eyes and the crow's feet. His face is within 2 inches of my nose. He is hanging over me like a mother over a baby. A perception that both emasculates Hugh and infantilizes Nell. To Nell's dismay, they will remain in this pub overnight, as a new carriage and horses are sought for. As Dick and Nell wait, the elderly landlady regales Nell with a narrative of their arrival, Hugh carrying the unconscious Nell in his arms, about which Nell writes, "Vultures gnawing my heart, I in Hugh's arms, with my head hanging over his shoulder and my mouth open. Disgusting tableau. Not only disgusting, but public, witnessed by the 2 grooms and the landlady, certainly by a barmaid, and a host of boozing boors. What is it about this scene, a gentleman carrying a lady to safety, that so disgusts Nell? First, it's the fact that Hugh has touched her, has felt her body against his. Second, it's the fact that this incident is so public. A member of the aristocracy with a long-standing family name and title, Nell should behave and be treated according to her position, with dignity and an acknowledgement of her superiority. She should not be seen in such an undignified position, unconscious, and carried into a public house like a fallen woman. Not only lower class, pubs in the 19th century were seen, writes the historian F.M.L. Thompson, as centers of a great underworld of sex, indecency, depravity, crime, cockfighting, gambling, plotting, and subversion. Certainly not a place for an upper-class 19-year-old girl to spend the night. Broughton shows little interest in the working class, the servants and farmhands and mill workers who might entertain themselves at a pub, and whose labor supports the Lestranges and the Lancasters. Representatives of the lower middle and working classes barely exist in the novel, although at one point, suggesting the social consequences of income inequality, Nell tells us that she is not fond of solitary walks, having a wholesome fear of beggar men. This night in the pub, then, is almost the only moment in the novel when we see Nell or any member of her class interact with workers. How alien this world is to her, and how discomforting with its stale beer and tobacco smells, and its boozing bores. This place where the barmaid's tee-hee, inharmonious as the laugh of the uneducated always is, rewards drunken men's sallies and mingles with their haw-haws. Nell finds herself in a lower world where the standards of the middle and upper classes do not apply, where men and women can engage in drunken and bawdy conversations. It's a world where clandestine pairings take place. Remember, a significant percentage of lower-class women were pregnant when they married. In this world, freed from upper-class strictures, Hugh can be more demonstrative with Nell, who sees him staring at her, or as she puts it, taking an inventory of my charms. Nell is spending the night alone on a narrow seat with a man who will keep edging an inch every 5 minutes nearer her, and who never moves his eyes from her face. At this point, feeling uneasy with the slightly creepy Hugh, Nell does something odd. Having bruised her arm in the carriage accident, she pulls down her sleeve and tells us about the beauty of her arm. What is there in nature or art so pretty, so appealing to the senses as a beautiful arm? Mine was beautiful, round and firm and polished like marble that some god had kissed into warm life, with dear little nicks and dimples about elbow and wrist. Given how fully Victorian women's bodies were clothed, arms and necks and ankles and ears and feet often receive sensuous description from Victorian novelists. The language Broughton uses here would seem to apply more to, say, a woman's breasts, round and firm like marble, kissed into warm life, than her arm. This displacement from a secondary sexual characteristic to a non-sexual body part is the essence of fetishism. A sense of fetish, of sadomasochism, is evident in her further description. I find a big black bruise and 2 long red scratches on the soft cream-white flesh. In a culture as sexually controlled as that of middle and upper-class Victorian England, in which moral codes had to be followed and even a modest expression of sexuality had to be disguised, Broughton uses men's and women's arms to suggest sexual intimacy. It's easy enough to spot this string of images. It's more difficult to explain its function. We know that these arms, being touched by a woman, carrying a woman, being bruised and exposed to a man, are in some elusive way sexual. But however suggestive this tale of arms and the man may be of other body parts, these arms remain arms. And yet they're not just arms. Nell's receptivity to Dick's holding her hand and her father's excessive reaction to it suggest a correspondence between simple acts of touch and sexual desire. Nell's touching Dick's arm, after having described him in what might be read phallically as stretching his long length, reveals her willingness to defy convention, to pursue a man, and thereby to fulfill her sexual desire, an interpretation further supported by Nell's calling this act indecently forward. On this reading, Hugh seems to acknowledge his shortcomings when he jealously refers to that long-legged McGregor. Hugh's carrying the unconscious Nell in his arms into a pub, on the other hand, reminds one of an elopement or a secret tryst. As Nell exposes her arm to Hugh, she tells him it hurts and describes herself looking up rather ruefully at Hugh, somewhat after the manner that a dog does that has got a thorn in his foot when he comes limping up with upheld paw. Hugh responds to this entreaty by bending down to kiss her bruise, a gesture from which Nell recoils in horror. The picture Broughton draws, a young girl lifting her sleeve to show bruises and scratches on her soft cream-white flesh, and looking apologetically, beseechingly into a man's eyes, could be taken straight from a volume of Victorian erotica. The picture of this helpless girl exposing her flesh to a powerful man reminds us, as I noted earlier, of how frequently a woman's attractiveness is equated with her girlishness. For instance, the male protagonist in Ellen Wood's East Lynne, like many a Victorian male, is attracted to the childlike aspect of his wife. She had fallen asleep, her head leaning against the trunk of a tree. Her bonnet and parasol lay at her feet. Her scarf had dropped, and she looked like a lovely child, her lips partly open, her cheeks flushed, and her beautiful hair falling around. Hugh's response to Nell, his desire to kiss her bruise, as a father would console a child, suggests a similar form of attraction. This infantilizing of women, especially this finding beauty in their childlike attributes, suggests, if not pedophilia, a form of sexual deviance. It's strange, though, that this view should be uncritically depicted by women writers. Broughton and Wood, I suppose, were too innocent to see anything aberrant here, and were merely reflecting a common male attitude, one they'd read in novels and seen in their own lives. Or perhaps the fault is mine, living in an age well aware of the evils of sexual abuse and pedophilia. I might be imposing my views on what are truly innocent descriptions of young women. Nell is aware of what her appearance in this setting signals. When Nell asks Hugh why he didn't accompany his grooms on their journey back to Wentworth, Hugh replies, "And leave you?" At this remark, Nell sees that neither words, tone, nor attitude are lost upon the landlady. She coughs a little and looks or makes as though she is looking towards something else, attempting to be discreet while glancing stealthily at Nell's left hand, presumably to determine if she is married. Nell describes her and Hugh's sitting down to tea as horribly honeymoonish. The appearance in this lower-class setting of this upper-class couple can mean but one thing: a clandestine sexual liaison. And so the landlady departs, the house grows silent, and night descends, Nell wishing she was still protected by the landlady's chaperonage. In this context, this honeymoonish setting, Nell's revealing her arm to Hugh, and then angrily jerking it away when he brushes it with his mustache, is suggestive of a wedding night, naked wife presenting herself to her husband, then responding with disgust when his hairy manhood brushes against her. As Broughton does here, Victorian novelists, severely limited in how they could depict sexual behavior, had to disguise, to suggest, to conceal. Earlier, Broughton had described Dick stretching his long length like a big Newfoundland, a big black web-footed rescue dog. The Newfoundland first appeared in England by way of Canada in the early 1800s. The poet George Gordon Lord Byron had a pet Newfoundland named Bosun, for whom he constructed a memorial, and on which he inscribed his poem Epitaph for a Dog. O man, thou feeble tenant of an hour, debased by slavery or corrupt by power, who knows thee well must quit thee with disgust, degraded mass of animated dust. Thy love is lust, thy friendship all a cheat, thy tongue hypocrisy, thy heart deceit. By nature vile, ennobled but by name, every kindred brute might bid thee blush for shame. Ye, who hold perchance this simple urn, pass on. It honors none you wish to mourn. To mark a friend's remains these stones arise. I never knew but one, and here he lies. Broughton could have seen a different Newfoundland, Napoleon the Wizard Dog, a star performer in Van Hane's Magic Circus, whose death in 1868 resulted in this obituary in the Sheffield Daily Telegraph. Death of a celebrated four-footed artiste. Mr. Van Hare's renowned dog, Napoleon, designated the Wizard Dog, died on 24th, aged 12 years. He was a noble specimen of the Newfoundland breed, weighing near 200 pounds, for which he took the prize at the first Agricultural Hall Dog Show. Besides his magnificent appearance and symmetry, he was the most extraordinary, sagacious, and highly trained animal ever known. He is now being preserved and beautifully mounted by the celebrated naturalist Mr. Edwin Ward. Among the dog prints which Hugh attempts to entertain Nell were likely some painted by Edward Landseer, whose paintings of Newfoundlands with titles like Off to the Rescue, a distinguished member of the Humane Society, and Saved, were so popular that Landseer became the official name of a breed of Newfoundland. Broughton's association of Dick with a Newfoundland, then, is not merely due to its size, but to this breed's reputation in the popular imagination, which was shaped by Landseer's paintings. As the Wikipedia entry on Landseer concludes, the paintings combine the Victorian conception of childhood with the appealing idea of noble animals devoted to humankind. Broughton continues her use of dog imagery when she describes Nell looking up at Hugh somewhat after the manner that a dog does. This animal imagery changes dramatically after Hugh's attempted kiss of Nell's bruise. Nell describes snatching her arm away as from a hyena about to mumble it. To mumble in this context means to eat with just one's gums. Since hyenas have powerful jaws and teeth which enable them to eat animal hides and bones, it's odd to describe a hyena about to mumble Nell's arm. A toothless hyena? Broughton chooses this animal, I suspect, because of its general unattractiveness, a furry-faced predator and scavenger, and because of its contrast with a Newfoundland, the one a creature that saves lives, the other one that consumes carcasses. Responding to Hugh's attempted mumble, Nell screams for him to leave her alone, fierce as a young tigress. She is transformed from lapdog to tigress, ferocious and feline, an animal more than equal to a hyena. Looking volumes of outraged virtue at him, Nell asks, "Will you never understand that I hate you?" This excessive response, her virtue has been outraged because Hugh has brushed his mustache against her arm, is evidence of Nell's youth and inexperience and of Victorian culture's strict moral code. But if we perceive the arm kissing as a stand-in for something more sexual, this reaction is understandable. Rejected and hated by a girl he thought sympathetic to his courting, Hugh becomes enraged. Immediately thereafter, their carriage arrives, and Hugh and Nell are returned to Wentworth, where Nell flees to her room. Closing Volume 1. For a transcript of this episode, along with the bibliography and other materials, please go to 19thcenturynovel.podbean.com.